Margaret Ellison stepped off the shuttle into the cavernous terminal of Denver International Airport, her wool coat bundled snugly around her shoulders against the crisp mountain air. At 69, she'd learned the art of moving through the world without demanding attention, silver hair pinned into a soft twist, sensible flat shoes clicking softly against polished floors, a weathered leather satchel slung over one arm. She paused at the departure board. Mountain Jet Flight 412 to Boston, boarding now, and pulled her printed boarding pass from her coat pocket. No flashing cameras, no speeches, just another quiet morning trip home after weeks of work with the Colorado Civil Rights Fund she chaired. Priority boarding for first class and elite members, the gate agent announced. Margaret stepped forward, offering her pass with a friendly nod. Category 1A, she said. The agent smiled and waved her toward the jet bridge. In her mind, she already tasted the black coffee waiting in 2A. Moments later, she entered the cabin and began to slide into her seat when a sharp voice cut through the hushed bustle. "Excuse me, ma'am?" A tall woman in a crisp navy uniform stood beside her. Blonde hair pulled back, clipboard in hand, eyes cool and appraising. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Margaret blinked. "Certainly," she replied, passing the paper over. She noted how other passengers glanced up, some with curiosity, others looking away too quickly. The flight attendant, Ms. Brooke Lambert, studied the pass. She tilted her head, lips pressing into a polite line. "This is first class," Margaret said gently. Brooke didn't move. Instead, she placed a gloved hand lightly on the armrest. "There may have been a mix-up," she said, voice steady but clipped. "I'm going to ask you to move to economy and we'll sort this out after takeoff." A soft murmur rippled through the cabin. The businessman in 2B looked up from his phone. A woman across the aisle exchanged a glance with her partner. Margaret felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Not anger, not fear, but a calm precision honed from decades on the bench. She folded the receipt she'd tucked in her book, slid it into her satchel, and stood without a word. Brooke stepped aside, maintaining that same practiced calm. Margaret turned and walked down the aisle toward the back of the plane. No one offered help. No one spoke. But everyone watched as she surrendered her seat in silence, a dignified surrender that stirred something in the air. Margaret settled into the aisle seat in the back of the plane and closed her eyes for a moment, as if she were simply another traveler easing into a long flight. In reality, she was anything but ordinary. Back home in Aspen, Colorado, she lived in a rustic, cedar-clad chalet perched among snow-dusted pines, a retreat she'd chosen after retiring from the bench. There, she spent her mornings reviewing case files over strong coffee, and her afternoons walking the ski runs. Always alone, always observant. Most people who saw her in Aspen assumed she was a local retiree or maybe a visiting grandmother. They didn't know that beneath the soft cashmere sweater and simple wool scarf, Margaret Ellison was once the Chief Justice of the Colorado Supreme Court, a position she held for 12 years, issuing landmark rulings on environmental protections, civil rights, and judicial reform. They didn't know that she now chaired the Colorado Civil Rights Fund, guiding a $210 million zero-cents endowment that supported voting rights initiatives and bias reduction training for state agencies. That fund was her daily focus, though very few at the fund's headquarters in Denver could name the quiet woman who signed every check. Margaret believed that real change happened away from the headlines. She spent her evenings drafting policy proposals in her study, wood-paneled walls lined with first edition legal treatises, and swapping notes with former clerks who now served in the governor's office. Her network stretched from small-town judges in Durango to federal appellate justices in Washington, D.C. This trip to Boston was no leisure flight. In 2 days, she would join a closed-door summit at the Federal Aviation Administration's Bias Mitigation Task Force, a meeting convened after a string of high-preferences customer service scandals. Margaret had been invited for her expertise on systemic discrimination and her reputation for disciplined, measured leadership. Yet here she was, bundled in a coat someone might buy at a discount shop, her silver hair twisted into a practice chignon. The boarding pass she waved held the weight of decades of precedent, but no uniform or badge proclaimed her authority. She reached into her satchel and ran her thumb across the engraved brass plate on her business card. Margaret Ellison, S.E.S., former Chief Justice. It was a small reminder, meant only for emergencies. She closed her satchel and let out a soft sigh. Soon enough, everyone on this flight would know exactly who she was and why it mattered. Margaret settled into seat 31F without a word, tucking her leather satchel onto her lap as the cabin lights hummed overhead. A few rows ahead, the first-class passenger in 2B flicked his gaze up from his phone, then quickly averted it. No one spoke. No one intervened. Moments later, the sharp click of heels echoed down the aisle. Brooke Lambert reappeared, clipboard in hand, an expression polite but unyielding. Her uniform jacket was impeccably pressed, her hair pulled back so taut it looked sculpted. She paused at Margaret's row and offered a tight-lipped smile. "Ma'am," Brooke said, voice hushed but firm, "we've noticed you're seated in economy. Could I see your boarding pass one more time?" Margaret reached into her pocket and produced the same paper ticket she'd shown twice before. Brooke's eyes flicked over it quickly, then up at Margaret's simple gray sweater and worn leather bag. She cleared her throat. "It appears there may have been a mix-up," Brooke continued. "This section is for economy class ticket holders only. I'll need you to return to the back." A soft stir rippled through the cabin, just enough that someone's magazine rustled. Margaret didn't flinch. She folded the pass and slipped it back into her satchel. "Thank you," she said, quietly, standing. Brooke stepped aside, chin level, as though offering Margaret the aisle. She kept her tone controlled, as if reminding herself this was protocol, not prejudice. But the line in her jaw betrayed a flicker of something. Surprise, perhaps, at Margaret's calm. Margaret walked past rows of muted faces, business travelers in crisp suits, a mother trying to soothe her toddler back to sleep. None of them offered a sympathetic glance. None murmured a protest. They watched instead as she disappeared down the aisle, her back straight, her pace deliberate. Reaching the last row, she slipped into a narrow window seat. The upholstery was thin, the legroom nearly non-existent. She placed her hands on the armrests and inhaled, steadying herself. Outside, the wingtip caught a shaft of sunlight, reminding her that this wasn't just a seat change, it was a statement. As she settled in, Margaret allowed herself a small, private acknowledgement of her own resolve. She had been judged by a glance and dismissed by a touch, but she wasn't angry, not yet. Instead, she felt something more precise. The quiet conviction that she would let this moment speak for her without raising her voice, and everyone on this flight would see exactly how that looked. Margaret sat frozen in her aisle seat, fingers clenched around the edge of her book, as Brooke Lambert reappeared at the front of the cabin. Brooke's expression was still polite. Too polite, Margaret thought, but there was steel behind those blue eyes. "Ma'am," Brooke said softly, "I'm going to ask you again to return to economy. Please gather your belongings." Brooke stepped forward, placing one gloved hand on the back of Margaret's leather satchel. The touch was light, almost clinical, but it carried an unmistakable message. You don't belong here. A hush rippled through first class as nearby passengers dropped their eyes or pretended to check their phones. Margaret rose without protest, gathering her coat and bag with deliberate slowness. As she pivoted in the narrow aisle, Brooke reached out to guide her, an almost tender gesture that felt like a shove. Margaret's silver hair brushed past Brooke's elbow. The attendant's crisp uniform smelled of starch and duty. The man in 2B offered a half-hearted smile. The woman across the aisle exchanged a regretful look with her companion. None of them spoke. None reached out. Margaret walked past plush leather seats and brass accents, each step echoing softly. The whisper of her coat brushing cabin carpet sounded louder than any shout. Somewhere behind her, a passenger murmured, "She must have been in the wrong seat," as if that made it okay. Margaret's chest tightened, not with anger, but with a precise clarity. She was witnessing how easily people accept injustice when it's served gently. She reached the back of the plane and slipped into seat 31F. The upholstery was threadbare, legroom non-existent. She tucked her legs into the cramped space, folded her coat across her lap, and placed her worn satchel at her feet. The overhead bins closed with a thud, sealing her in a far smaller world. Margaret lifted her gaze to the curtain separating classes. Brooke stood just beyond it, clipboard clutched against her chest, as though that was enough to shield her from accountability. Margaret felt a quiet resolve settle over her. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't caused a scene, she simply endured. And now, everyone on this flight had seen exactly how that looked. Margaret settled back into 31F and let her shoulders drop, feeling the thin economy cushion give beneath her. Around her, the cabin crew moved with quiet efficiency. A flight attendant closing the overhead bin here, another clicking in a seatbelt there. The hum of the engines thrummed through the floor, a low reminder that this wasn't just a moment in time. It was a moving vessel, bound for Boston. No one approached her, no one offered sympathy. She considered that a small victory. Reaching into her satchel, Margaret drew out her phone and tapped the secure judicial communications icon. The app sprang to life with a familiar blue and white interface, custom-built for her role as Chair Emerita of the Colorado Civil Rights Fund. She selected Emergency Override and entered the code 117B-JD, the shorthand for Unauthorized First-Class Displacement. Her thumb hovered over Send, then pressed firmly. A single vibration confirmed the message was in the system. She placed the phone screen down against her bag, as if to shield it from view. For a moment, she just listened. Soft chatter, the zip of a beverage cart wheel, the distant ding of a galley service button. Somewhere up front, a mother hushed her toddler. A businessman in 2C adjusted his tie, offering her a quick nod that spoke volumes. He'd seen it too. No one applauded. No one gasped. But they all sensed something had shifted. Margaret drew in a steady breath and let it out just as slowly. She wasn't angry. Anger would have been a spotlight she refused to enter. Instead, she felt the precise calm of a judge who'd weighed a verdict and found the facts undeniable. The plane remained still at the gate, engines idling, as FAA protocols stirred into motion somewhere behind closed doors. As she folded her hands in her lap, Margaret allowed herself a small, private acknowledgement. Her silence had power. She hadn't raised her voice, and yet the system would answer her. The cabin felt smaller now, charged with expectancy. She leaned her head against the window frame and closed her eyes briefly, just to savor that quiet certainty. Soon enough, everyone on Flight 412 would understand exactly what happens when you make one call. Margaret leaned back in 31F, folding her arms across the thin economy seat as the cabin settled into an odd quiet. The overhead bins clicked shut one by one, and somewhere near the front, the flight attendant who'd escorted her down the aisle, Brooke, took a long, steadying breath. Margaret noted it without looking up. She'd read that same gesture hundreds of times, from counsel facing tough cross-examination. A soft chime sounded at the cockpit door, too gentle for the safety announcement. Instinctively, Margaret glanced up. A flight attendant passed by, pausing mid-step to check a tablet display, her brow furrowing. The screen briefly showed Gatehold, Fac F.A. Portugal. Before flipping back to meal service, 2 rows ahead, Emily Carter, the junior attendant, leaned in to whisper to her colleague. "Did you see that? Something's going on." Her colleague shrugged, scanning Margaret's direction as if suddenly curious about the silent passenger in 31F. Their voices were hushed, but Margaret caught the word investigation. The hum of the engines felt heavier now, as if the plane itself sensed a shift. A subtle change rippled through the cabin. Trays were clipped into position with extra care. A businessman in 2B double-checked his seatbelt, and the murmur of pre-flight chatter sank to a cautious hush. Margaret kept her gaze forward, folding her hands in her lap. She felt a small pulse of satisfaction. A single code sent through the Judicial Communications app had awakened the system. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't demanded. Yet here was the first sign that her quiet action was moving things into motion. Another chime, this one followed by a clipped voice over the intercom. "Cabin crew, please confirm all service stations secure for a brief delay." The announcement was routine enough, except that routine flights didn't typically pause before pushback. Brooke passed Margaret in the aisle, clipboard in hand, hesitation flickering across her face before she composed herself. She offered Margaret a curt nod, an unspoken apology lurking in her eyes. Margaret met that nod with a discreet, almost imperceptible lift of her own chin. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. The truth had started to surface, and everyone on Flight 412 was now part of the audience. The plane hadn't moved an inch, but in that stillness, the real journey was just beginning. A soft ping echoed from the cockpit door, slicing through the low murmur in economy. Brooke Lambert, still clutching her clipboard, paused, shoulders stiffening. A moment later, the intercom cracked to life. "Miss Lambert, please report to the cockpit." Her practiced calm wavered. She tucked her chin and started down the narrow aisle, every eye tracking her polished shoes. Margaret caught Brooke's glance, a flicker of panic, before the attendant ducked behind the curtain. Once inside, Brooke found Captain Darnell and his first officer Reynolds waiting. The cockpit felt impossibly small. The door clicked shut behind her. "Captain Darnell, Brooke, I need you to confirm something." "Yes, Captain." "Darnell, passenger 2A, originally in first class, who you escorted to economy. Her name is Margaret Ellison, former Chief Justice of the Colorado Supreme Court." Brooke's breath caught. Her fingers tightened around the clipboard. "Brooke, I verified the manifest, but her name wasn't listed under first class." "Reynolds. She was flying under an executive pass tied to her post-retirement role. It's in the FAA override system." "Darnell, someone just flagged it. We've been ordered to hold at the gate under federal oversight. No pushback until this is cleared." Brooke glanced at the instrument panel. No taxi clearance, no pushback lights. The hum of engines suddenly sounded loud. She swallowed. "Brooke, so what do you want me to do?" "Darnell, apologize. Escort her back to 2A. Then you'll remain here for further questioning by FAA. And Brooke." "Brooke, yes?" "Darnell, be honest." Her knuckles white, Brooke nodded. The captain offered a curt, sympathetic lift of his eyebrows before turning back to the gauges. Moments later, Brooke re-entered the cabin. First class had gone eerily silent. She paused at the curtain, taking a breath to steel herself. Margaret looked up, calm as ever. Without a word, Brooke stepped forward, clipboard lowered. The tension in the aisle crackled. Passengers leaned in, phones forgotten. Brooke met Margaret's steady gaze. "Judge Ellison, I'm sorry." Margaret nodded once, then reached for her coat. In that charged stillness, everyone understood. This was only the beginning of a reckoning. A soft hiss of the cabin door announced the arrival of two figures from the jet bridge. A sharply dressed FAA oversight officer in a navy blazer, badge glinting on his lapel, and a stern-faced Department of Transportation representative. Brooke Lambert froze mid-aisle. The officer stepped forward, voice calm but carrying authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, projecting just enough so every head turned. "Under Judicial Referral Code 117 BJD, we are convening an in-flight ethical hearing to investigate an unauthorized displacement of a first-class passenger. I ask that all cabin crew remain at your stations and that no one leave their seats." A hush fell over the cabin. The overhead bins clicked shut, and every passenger's eyes tracked the officer as he paused at the curtain. He pulled out a small tablet, tapped it once, then spoke again. "Passenger in seat 31F, please stand." Margaret rose deliberately, coat folded neatly in her arms. She crossed to the divider, where the officer nodded politely. "Judge Ellison," he said, "thank you for joining us. We've gathered as witnesses those who observed the incident, including Ms. Lambert." Brooke swallowed, clutching her clipboard. The officer continued, "This is not a criminal proceeding, but it is a formal inquiry under federal airline ethics regulations. You will each have an opportunity to answer questions." Heads swiveled. A man in row 2 reached for his phone but thought better of it. Someone further back leaned forward, curiosity piqued. The cabin felt transformed. Once a place of hushed comfort, now a makeshift courtroom, where every seat was a witness's vantage. Margaret stepped forward, voice measured yet carrying like a judge in her own courtroom. "Thank you, Officer Hayes," she said, using the name on his badge. "This hearing isn't about punishment. It's about accountability and ensuring every passenger, regardless of age or attire, is treated with respect." Brooke's shoulders sagged beneath the weight of every eye on her. The officer handed Margaret a small microphone. She accepted it with grace. "Miss Lambert," Margaret addressed the flight attendant directly, "could you explain what criteria you use to remove me from my seat?" Brooke's lips trembled. In that instant, the cabin held its breath. Every passenger aware that the truth was about to be laid bare, not with anger or spectacle, but with the quiet force of justice in motion. A stunned hush fell over the cabin as Officer Hayes turned from Margaret to Brooke Lambert. He cleared his throat, voice steely but calm. "Miss Lambert, effective immediately, you are suspended from flight duty under Article 2.1 of our bias conduct policy. Please collect your personal items and prepare to disembark." Brooke's clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered on the floor. She swallowed, fingers trembling as she bent to pick it up. The other flight attendants froze mid-service, trays half-filled, eyes darting between Brooke and the stern officer. Margaret watched from row 2A, coat folded neatly on her lap. She said nothing. She didn't have to. The cabin's attention was fixed on Brooke as the FA officer stepped forward, gently resting a hand on Brooke's elbow. He guided her toward the rear door, each footstep echoing like a judge's gavel. A murmur rippled through first class, a ripple that turned into a wave of collective relief. The businessman in 2B set down his briefcase. A college student across the aisle lowered her phone, jaw slack. No one cheered. This wasn't a spectacle. But you could feel the tension drain from the room. Brooke paused at the aft exit, shoulders hunched. She bent to retrieve her name tag and pen from the galley counter, then tucked them into her uniform pocket. Every movement was painfully deliberate, as if she were trying to memorize the cabin one last time. As the FA agent stepped onto the jet bridge, the intercom buzzed to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. Flight 412 will depart approximately 90 minutes behind schedule. That announcement landed like a gentle apology, softer than any clap, but it spoke volumes. The engines idled, waiting. Cabin crew exchanged sympathetic glances. Passengers leaned back in their seats, some closing their eyes, others exhaling in quiet satisfaction. Margaret exhaled too, but her expression remained composed. She lifted her gaze to the curtain, now swaying lightly in the breeze from the jet bridge. Brooke was gone, but the cabin's atmosphere had permanently shifted. Justice had walked out the same door it once tried to push her through. In that stillness, everyone on Flight 412 understood the cost of bias was real, and sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one who refuses to step off the stage. The captain's voice came through the intercom, calm and even. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We invite Ms. Ellison back to first class." Margaret felt a small flutter of satisfaction as she stood. She gathered her coat and satchel, smoothing the fabric of her sweater. The aisle felt different now, hushed, expectant. Passengers shifted in their seats, eyes following her ascent back toward 2A. Brooke's empty spot in 2B was an open reminder of what had happened. Margaret stepped through the curtain and paused for a moment, letting the soft glow of the reading light wash over her. She gave a polite nod to the flight attendant at the galley, then continued to her original seat. The leather felt warm beneath her fingertips as she settled back in. Ripple went through the cabin, quiet apologies drifting on the air. The man beside her original spot, a gentleman in his early 60s, wearing a well-worn blazer, leaned over with genuine regret. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up earlier," he said, voice low. Margaret looked at him, her lips curving into a gentle but firm smile. "Sometimes silence is a choice," she replied, her tone soft but clear. "Used at the right moment, it carries its own weight." He nodded, eyes glistening just a bit. Around them, other passengers shifted. Some lowered their gazes, some exchanged small, understanding smiles. No one applauded. There was no fanfare. Instead, there was a shared recognition that dignity had been restored, and that respect could come quietly, without fanfare or raised voices. Margaret adjusted her coat across her lap, taking in the scene. The flight attendant offering a fresh glass of water, the mother soothing her toddler with a smile, the business traveler closing his laptop. It was all unfolding as it should have. Ordinary service tinged with something. In that moment, Margaret felt her entire journey converge. Years on the bench, late nights drafting policy, mornings spent in Aspen's silence, all leading to this precise, unspoken verdict. She was back where she belonged, not because she demanded it, but because she'd allowed the system to see what truly mattered. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its taxi, Margaret leaned back, eyes fixed on the window. The world outside seemed the same, but inside the cabin, everything had changed, and in that stillness, her stillness, justice had quietly taken its throne. Margaret sat quietly in her first-class seat as the engines idled, but the world beyond Flight 412 was anything but still. Within minutes of Brooke Lambert's suspension and the in-flight hearing, a short clip began circulating on social media. 45 seconds of Margaret's calm, clipped questions and Brooke's stunned apology. By the time the jet pushed back from the gate, Flight 412 Justice was trending in 3 time zones. Across Colorado, Denver International Airport employees gathered around smartphones. A TSA officer murmured, "I didn't know she was former Chief Justice Ellison," to a colleague, whose eyes widened. Over in Boston, staff at the FAA's Bias Mitigation Task Force paused their morning briefing when the same clip hit their conference room screens. Someone whispered, "That's the hearing we requested." By midday, traditional outlets had picked up the story. The Denver Post ran a headline, "Retired Judges Silence Grounds Flight. FAA Orders Ethics Review." The next section detailed how the in-cabin hearing had been convened under Judicial Referral Code 117B-JDE, a rarely used protocol that allowed a citizen with judicial credentials to trigger emergency oversight. The article included a quote from an FAA spokesperson. "Flight 402's delay underscores why we're expanding mandatory bias awareness training and instituting pre-boarding ticket verification for all passengers." Meanwhile, the U.S. Department of Transportation issued a formal statement. This incident serves as a critical reminder that every traveler, regardless of age, attire, or status, deserves fair treatment. We are working with airlines to adopt standardized verification procedures and real-time reporting mechanisms to prevent similar occurrences. On Capitol Hill, aides to several Colorado senators received talking points within the hour. One memo, marked high priority, urged staffers to schedule a hearing on consumer protection in air travel. Another suggested inviting Margaret to testify before the Senate Commerce Committee, not as a victim, but as an expert on systemic discrimination. Back at her Aspen chalet that evening, Margaret poured herself a small glass of tea and scrolled through a curated newsfeed. She saw comments ranging from, "This is the kind of grace under pressure we need," to, "She didn't yell, and that made everyone listen." A particularly thoughtful note from a retired school teacher read, "I showed this to my book club. Our next read is Civil Rights History." Margaret allowed herself a small smile. She hadn't sought attention, but she recognized that her silence had sparked a conversation far larger than one flight. Within FAA headquarters, leadership announced the creation of a Fair Boarding Task Force, co-chaired by the FAA's Chief Diversity Officer and a representative from the National Association of Senior Citizens. Their charge: implement nationwide ticket equality protocols and develop a public dashboard where passengers could report suspected bias incidents in real time. It was a first in U.S. aviation history. At Mountain Jet's Denver offices, CEO Clara Reynolds drafted a memo to employees. "Today, our crew learned a powerful lesson in empathy and accountability. We will partner with the FAA task force, revise our boarding policies, and ensure every customer feels seen and respected." Employees printed the memo and posted it in break rooms. Flight attendants discussed it on their layovers, some with pride, others with a twinge of remorse. Overhead, in the flight crew briefing room, junior attendants practiced new boarding scripts that prioritized courtesy without compromise. That same night, outlets in Chicago and New York picked up the national wires, framing Margaret not as a passenger who demanded retribution, but as an architect of change. One headline read, "Judge Ellison's Quiet Command: How Silence Became the Loudest Call for Respect in Air Travel." Margaret set her phone aside and gazed out her window at the darkening aspen pines. She reflected on the journey. A simple boarding pass, a single nonviolent challenge, and enough institutional muscle to force a system to pause and listen. In that moment, she felt the full weight of what had happened, not as a personal victory, but as the first tremor in a broader movement toward dignity and fairness for every traveler. In silence, she had spoken volumes, and the echo was only just beginning. Margaret stepped onto the modest stage in Boston's Civic Center. No grand podium, just a wooden lectern and a single mic. Veterans, community leaders, and policymakers filled folding chairs, their faces still echoing the morning's headlines. A hush fell as she approached. She glanced down at her notes, just 3 lines on a crisp card, but let her eyes travel across the room before speaking. "Good afternoon. I didn't come here to relive what happened on Flight 412, she began, voice calm but carrying. "I came because too many people have been asked to move, silenced, or dismissed without ever being seen. There was no dramatic pause. She folded her card and continued. I didn't want justice for me. I wanted accountability for the next person in a gray coat, a worn bag, or simple shoes. Heads nodded. Somewhere near the back, a man in uniform pressed his palm to his heart. Margaret leaned in slightly. We're not here to shame individuals. We're here to fix a system that still lets bias carry more weight than a boarding pass. Today, the FAA has committed to real-time reporting. Airlines have pledged bias awareness training. And I trust you, every one of you, to make sure those promises aren't just words on a page. The small audience rose in a respectful standing ovation, soft but unwavering. Margaret stepped back, offered a brief nod, and left the stage without looking for applause. Back on flight 4412. The cabin had long since emptied. In first class, seat 2A waited under the reading light. The leather cushion untouched, Margaret's folded gray coat still draped over the armrest. On the tray table lay a single note card, scrawled in elegant script. Sometimes justice doesn't walk out in uniforms. It sits quietly until you ask the right questions. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating that note like a quiet beacon. No one was on board to witness it, yet its message lingered in the empty cabin air. Yes. Have you ever been asked to move to a back row, a lesser role, or a quieter place because someone assumed you didn't belong? Drop your story in the comments. Your voice matters, and together we can make sure no one's dignity is left sitting in silence. If you believe in quiet power and real accountability, hit subscribe and join us for more stories where justice speaks softly and lands loudly.